You are listening to That Hoarder Overcome Compulsive Hoarding. I'm a hoarder who needed an outlet to talk about this unusual and isolating mental illness. And because my hoarding is secret, I started this podcast to talk about it. Subscribe to the podcast and find my social media links, episode transcripts, and every link that I mention at overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk. Finally, I am not a doctor, I'm just a hoarder doing her best. So do seek professional support if and when you need it. Hey, how are you? I am all right. I am recording suspiciously early for me. I have a busy week ahead, but I think it's going to be good. I hope it's going to be good.
Let's start with some housekeeping.
Brief bit of housekeeping. Had the 4th De-Hoarding Accountability Zoom session on Friday, and it was excellent. So if you would like to come along to the next one, head over to overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk/ticket. It's pretty low key. You can contribute as much or as little as you want. And it's just a nice supportive space. So I hope to see you there.
It's time for the pointless thing I found this week.
Now this thing is inexplicable. I have no idea why it was in my house. Quite often I can pick up the weirdest thing and remember the entire story of why it's there. This thing, still no clue. I was sorting through a bag of stuff and it was mostly papers, and then I found a rubber goldfish that had really bulgy eyes, and it had a red ribbon tied round it, and it had some staples in it, like it had been stapled somewhere. I have no memory of anyone giving it me. I can't think of a single reason anyone would have given it me, but the alternative explanation is that I procured my own rubber goldfish, tied a red ribbon round it, and stapled it somewhere, which is just as incomprehensible. I shared it on Instagram because it was so bizarre. So if you want to head over to That Hoarder podcast on Instagram, you can see it for yourself. It was the weirdest thing, and it's kind of unsettling to think I've got so much nonsense in my house that somehow a goldfish with a red ribbon tied around it escaped my notice for I don't know how long. It went in the bin. I could have probably donated it, but I can't imagine that selling in a charity shop, or indeed I certainly couldn't think of anyone who would want a rubber goldfish in that state. So that was definitely the weird, pointless, odd, bizarre thing I found this week. So I watched a film at a film festival called Where Dragons Live, and it was not about hoarding, but it was about a lot of themes that spoke very loudly to me in a hoarding sense. It was the story of a family clearing their parents' home after they had both died. This was a pretty well-off family. In the 60s, they had sold a painting of St. George and the Dragon, and they sold it for £220,000 in 1966, which I looked up is the equivalent of £3.5 million now, about $4.5 million US now. So with that money, they bought this incredible house and gardens. There was quite a long shot of this house early on from the outside, and it was clearly a very, very beautiful house. And it had these grounds that were just as beautiful. But the longer this shot was on the house and we were looking at it, I started thinking, is it beautiful or is it a bit sinister? Actually, I don't quite know anymore. And so it seemed like the dad of the family had died some time ago, but the mum had died recently. And so their children and their children, so basically parents, children, grandchildren. The parents had died. They had all gone to the house to sort through it and take the things they wanted, work out what could be sold, experience the house and grounds for the last time. And it was a situation that obviously people go through every day, but this was quite stark, I think, because it was this incredible setting that had a slight edge of something uncomfortable. And that was reflected through the film. These people were sorting through their parents' stuff and going through that whole mixture of feelings and emotions that a lot of us can relate to when we go to our childhood home. It can be a strange thing. You can feel suddenly like you're 14 again and you react in a way to things as if you were a hormonal teenager, and other times it's lovely and nostalgic. The children who are, in their, I would say, 40s, 50s and 60s, but I have to keep calling them the children to differentiate from the people who died, were going through a lot of mixed feelings. And through looking through their parents' stuff, they were also re-experiencing some things and re-remembering some things, and their thoughts and reactions were changing over time. And it came through that while these people had had an upbringing in a very beautiful setting, and they were, very well off, and that was all good. So there was that kind of privileged situation there. But there were also oddities. The sons had never been allowed to use the front stairs. Only women could sit on a particular sofa. There were signs all around the house telling people mostly what not to do. Don't put knives in this drawer. Don't do this here. Don't use this cup. There was a few mugs that just had signs in them saying, don't use this cup. And that made me smile from a hoarding point of view. Like, for some reason, they had to keep the cups. The parents had felt they had to keep the cups for whatever reason. And yet were they too good to use? Were they too broken to use? Were they too valuable to use? If they were broken, why were they still there? If they were valuable or too good, does that mean nobody enjoyed them? And is that a shame, maybe? The reason it's called Where Dragons Live, the film, is not just because the house was bought through selling a painting of George and the Dragon. It's because dragons were a theme in this family. There was a lot of dragon stuff. There were a lot of dragon stories told. There were lots of imagination around dragons. And these kept popping up as we were seeing all these generations of papers and belongings and knickknacks. And I think many people who have had to sort through a relative's home after they have passed away can relate to the dilemmas you face around, I kind of want to keep all of it today, tomorrow I might want to keep none of it. In reality, I need to pick a few bits and let the rest go. As well as the themes of dragons, there were some other themes that I spotted. One was skeletons. The number of times animal skeletons came up in conversation was significantly more than you would normally expect as animal skeletons to come up in conversation. Whether it was somebody took the front of a fireplace and found 36 jackdaw skeletons, and there were treasures from the daughter's childhood that involved various animal carcasses, and it made me think a lot, obviously, of skeletons in the closet that we've all got, every family's got. We as hoarders might particularly feel this is one of ours. But the other theme that kept coming up was fear. The children, i.e. the grandchildren, it's really confusing. The grandchildren were talking of how they used to be afraid of the house, the boy in particular. The daughter, the adult daughter, talked a lot about how she was terrified of dragons and monsters, and yet also fascinated by them. And this duality of like the house is enchanting and a bit sinister. Dragons are a theme throughout this home and also really scary. Going back to your parents' house is lovely and awful. Sorting through the belongings of the mother you had a quite strained relationship with is very sad, and also there are edges of pain, a different kind of pain in there than grief. And I think a lot in hoarding terms about those similar ways in which we expect or imagine thoughts and feelings to be a binary. It would either be left or right. It would either be yes or no. But in reality, an awful lot of our thoughts and feelings and reactions and emotions and experiences are very, very mixed and nuanced. And how we may feel more comfortable only making decisions we are dead set on, we are absolutely convinced by. But in order to move through our life, we also have to make decisions we feel a bit mixed about or unsure about. And the clear theme that related to hoarding for me with this film is obviously that when we die, whenever that may be, somebody will have to deal with our stuff. That is something that worries me a lot. It's something I think about a lot. And whether that is somebody who knows and loves you, or whether it's a stranger from a house clearance company, thinking now of what that will be like for them can help to spur us on when we're trying to turn our homes into somewhere that's more livable, more pleasant, safer, easier to get around. And how even if we want to be in denial, either about the fact that we're going to die at all, or about the stuff we're leaving behind and what that will mean for the people who have to sort through it, they're not nice to think about. But as responsible adults, we do need to give it some thought. There was one point where one of the sons and the daughter were looking through a box of rocks and pebbles, and the man said that he thought we should keep one or two of them to honour the fact that they were important to our dad. And the daughter said, and I wrote this down, if they wanted their possessions to be honoured, they should perhaps not have left quite so many of them. I'm going to say that again. If they wanted their possessions to be honoured, they should perhaps not have left quite so many of them. And this was not a hoarded house. It was a full house, but perfectly functioning. It was also massive with lots of nooks and crannies, so there was lots of space for things to have been left in a way that didn't mean everywhere was cluttered, but it meant there was a lot for them to sort through. But whenever we think, oh, I can't throw this away, it will be good for somebody, or my children might want that, or my grandchildren will want to remember this. If it's one thing in a box of 50 things, they may not find it, they may not recognize its value because it is in a morass of chaos. I'm going to say again what the daughter said. If they wanted their possessions to be honoured, they should perhaps not have left quite so many of them. I hate the thought of me leaving this chaos to somebody else to fix, in the midst of whoever it is who's trying to clear it out, also presumably grieving. And having spent half of this year grieving quite profoundly, I'm feeling that more strongly than ever. Grieving is pretty awful. And to have a hoarded home to empty on top of that is a grim thing to leave to somebody. And when there's loads and loads and loads and loads and loads and loads of it, people can't spot and value and cherish the important bits. Tracy McCubbin, on a former episode of this podcast, said, if everything's special, nothing's special. And it's really, really true. When you're sorting through 8 filing cabinets of paper, it's really easy to miss the one important bit, isn't it? And we can't expect people to take care of everything they pick up when they are surrounded by an overwhelming amount of someone else's stuff that is, some of which may be useful or valuable or pretty, but a lot of which is not. I enjoy making this podcast and it helps me on a personal level. It's a lot of work, but the feedback I get makes it worthwhile. I fund everything about the podcast myself. So if you want to help to ensure the future of the podcast, you can help me to cover the costs by sending a one-off or recurring donation at overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk/donate. So if we look at the idea of what we leave behind, the other thing this film expressed was that while they were dealing with the physical stuff, they were also dealing with the mixed and confusing feelings about their family, about their parents, about their upbringing, about their childhood, about the home itself. At one point, the grandson and granddaughter are talking about selling the house, and the granddaughter doesn't want the adults to sell the house. And so the grandson is explaining about inheritance tax and, why it has to be sold. But he said to the granddaughter, it's not like Grandma Jane was the house. Grandma Jane was more than that. It's not all about what she owned, it's about what she did. And what that young boy was saying to his sister was, the house will be gone. Well, it won't be gone, it will belong to somebody else. But that's not losing Grandma Jane, because Grandma Jane was more than this house and these grounds. Grandma Jane was the person who loved us. Grandma Jane was the person who, whatever Grandma Jane did, and the physical house doesn't change any of what Grandma Jane meant to those kids. Because what we leave behind is the stuff that is significant. But what we leave behind is also how we treated people, how we made people feel, what fascinated people about us, what are those little connections we made with people. Since my 2 friends died this year, I've found a number of almost spooky connections with other people who did not know either friend, but through me talking about their lives, we've discovered that they did actually have a connection. And it makes me wonder about how many of these unknown connections we all have to so many people. And also those strong, clearer connections we have with friends, with family, with whoever's important to us and whoever we are important to. So when a particular story was in the news a week or 2 ago, my first thought was of the first of those friends who died. I initially went, oh, I must send that too, and then remembered. But awful as that realization is every time, it is also nice that for me, while being many things in my life, those 2 friends were important enough that when I hear a song or when I hear a bit of news or when I read a funny story, they might be the people to pop up in my head as, oh, I must send that too. I must tell that too. I remember with an ex-girlfriend, we were together quite a long time, and so we had a lot of in-jokes, you know how it is. And one of the weirdest things after we split up was whenever I heard a particular phrase that we would have a joke about, or whenever I went to a particular place that we had a joke about, I would immediately think of her. And that was difficult and painful at first, but now is quite lovely and just makes me smile. So there are the big significant things we do for people, like if you are somebody's maid of honour at their wedding, or if you are somebody's best friend at school, or if you saved somebody from a burning building. There are those big things. And then there's the things like, oh, that person makes me feel so good about myself. Or that person is really calming when I'm anxious. Or that person is really funny just when I think everything's too miserable to ever laugh again. We can be all of those things and more. That's what we can leave behind that is far more significant and meaningful to the people who are left behind than a box of papers, a room of magazines floor to ceiling, 132 bottles of shampoo, 3,500 teddy bears, I don't know. We leave behind a lot of stuff. And I think we need to think two ways about that. One, how can I minimize what is physically in my home so that whether I die soon or in decades' time, I'm not adding to somebody else's stress when they are grieving, or to the expense if they are hired professionals. And the other way to think about what we leave behind is how we treat people, how we make people feel, what associations people have when they think of us, what funny story do they retell to everybody that you told them, what book do you always think of a particular person when you read it because they recommended it to you. Those bits are more meaningful and more powerful than any amount of whether it's genuinely valuable clutter or absolutely worthless clutter, worthless to anybody other than us. These people in the film, a lot of the stuff that was left behind was unnecessary, and that was balanced out by the stuff that was left behind that was incredibly valuable financially, but also what they got from those days in the house that they'd grown up in was more than what they packed into the back of their car when they drove away for the final time. It's not like Grandma Jane was the house. Grandma Jane was more than that. It's not all about what she owned, it's about what she did. Let's think about that. And let's think about how we can minimize the physical job in advance of somebody else having to deal with it. So shout out this week to a podcast from the BBC called Seriously. And here is Professor Ian Robertson with some good advice. Have a listen.
And Ian's final top tip for getting out of a slump riffs off the age-old wisdom of 13th century Persian poet Rumi, who famously said,
"The path only appears with the first step." Such a profound statement, because what that means is you have to take action. Most of the time for progression in life, you have to take action where there's no certainty of the outcome. But you have to take that step forward. And in doing that, immediately you have a different perspective on the world. You will see things, meet things, encounter things, think thoughts that you would not have encountered had you not taken that step forward.
Yeah, it's a self-fulfilling circle.
It is absolutely. Confidence works because it is linked to action. It's not optimism, which is a kind of belief that things will turn out okay, and it's not self-esteem, the evaluation of yourself. Confidence in the brain is linked to the action systems of the brain, and it helps you take actions that will make it likely you will achieve a reward. When you get that reward, it lifts your mood and makes future rewards, future bigger rewards, more likely. And that is an amazing antidote to apathy.
So I will link to Seriously in the show notes at overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk. And thank you for listening, and I will speak to you next time. Thank you for listening to That Hoarder Overcome Compulsive Hoarding podcast. It's been a pleasure to have you on board. You can find all the links I've mentioned and a transcript of the episode online at overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk. To find out more about how you can support this podcast and the overall project, go to overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk/support and do subscribe to the podcast so you make sure you don't miss any future episodes. There may be links in this podcast that earn me money. This doesn't come at any extra cost to you if you make a purchase through those links, and it helps to support the podcast.